Welcome to the Jason D'Souza Show. Join us as we explore the evolving urban landscape, uncovering the trends, stories, and innovations shaping our cities. Thanks for watching and enjoy today's episode.
Eamon Waterford, welcome to the Jason D'Souza Show.
Thanks for having me, Jason.
Oh, pleasure. It's great to have you here. And you have been busy. I've seen you on social media. I've seen you kind of running around. I see you speaking at conferences, and it must be important, whatever you're saying.
Well, it's interesting, if nothing else. I love that I get to talk about anything that's going on in Sydney.
So actually we should say that. So you're the CEO of the Committee for Sydney. And I've always thought the committee concept was really interesting. You know, there's a committee for Sydney, there's a committee for Brisbane, there's a committee for San Francisco.
Yeah.
Each sort of city has an advocacy body. Why?
So it's come out of a desire of the business community to be more involved in civic dialogue, I suppose. So they've often seen, there is often political advocacy groups, there is government, obviously, but business and its perspectives are often missing from broader public debates. Business is really good at advocating for itself around, quite sort of specific business issues, taxation or IR, but on broader issues that matter to the people who work for businesses and for the business owners, they're often not considered in those conversations. So typically what we see with the committee's model is it's come from a frustration from the business community that they want to be involved in civic dialogue and they need a body to do that.
What do you define as civic dialogue?
So the simplest way to talk about what we talk about is that we talk about the long-term challenges facing the city. If a business chamber is advocating for the issues that are facing cities in the next, or businesses in the next 6 to 12 months, we're often talking about the issues over the next 5 to 10 years. So what are the long-term challenges that a city is facing to be sustainable, productive, equitable, thriving and vibrant, because businesses understand that if they want to have a long-term success in that city, the city has to be successful. If you want to make your next quarterly earnings, that's not the Committee for Sydney's job. But if you want to make sure that there's a market for your services in 10 years' time, that's where we come in.
And I know you've got a lot of the big employers in the City of Sydney region sort of as members. So, we're being hosted here by Lendlease. They're one of your members. I think they're on your board, right? Is Tom McKellar on your board?
Tom McKellar's on my board,
He's the global head of development here. He's a good guy.
Good bloke.
Well, he is.
My boss.
He is. Well, there you go, right?
I'm not allowed to say anything else. No.
But who else are members?
There's about 155 organisations, and over time it's moved from being just about businesses to large organisations of all types. So probably about 130 of those are businesses, and that'll be, in fact, we cap membership to any one sector to 10% of our membership.
Oh, really?
Yeah, okay. To ensure that we have that diversity of perspective and we're not sort of overweight or seen to be overweight in any one particular sector. So we've got 10 property developers, we got 10 engineers, we've got architecture, landscape architecture, design, planning, we have tech firms, financial services, utilities, energy, water, transport, infrastructure, cultural organisations, and so we start to sort of also bring in organisations that would roughly be considered not-for-profit or government, but are still committed to that long-term dialogue. So local government, we have about 12 local governments as members, universities as members, community housing providers, so not-for-profit property developers and managers, cultural institutions, the art gallery, the opera house, they're all members of the organisation as well. So what that enables us to do is to have kind of every different methodology you need to solve problems somewhere in our membership. If we've got a complex challenge that the city's facing, we can bring to bear experts of all different walks of life and perspectives to help solve that problem, and do it in such a way that you can draw on the expertise of an industry without just presenting the perspective of that industry alone. You can really test and tease and compete and argue over what's going to work for a particular business sector or a particular industry versus another, and how we find kind of mutual win-wins or trade-offs that everybody's comfortable with.
And I certainly during my time working in here at Lendlease at the listed corporate sector, the committee was very useful. Because when we were advocating for things like overstation development, which was sort of an anathema to train developers who want to develop train stations, quite rightly. What do you mean we want to build property around train stations or on top of train stations? And I think in a city like Sydney, in fact, the Premier was saying this just the other day at his budget breakfast, that the metro has transformed Sydney. No one imagined you could go from Marrickville or Sydenham to the North Shore in 10 minutes, 12 minutes, and all of a sudden that has connected communities by public transport that would never have imagined being connected by public transport. So I think now this is a city sort of transformed by that sort of concept, and the committee being able to advocate for that, in particular when you are working in a property company or an engineer or whatever, everyone looks at you and says, you're just a bloke with a vested interest, right? You're a property developer, you want to develop property. You're an engineer, you want to do engineering. You want to, right? The committee at least gives that kind of advantage. So I think you guys do a great job.
And I guess it's worth noting as well, two points. It's important that people make money from these sorts of projects because the profit motive is actually what is sort of deploying capital, energy, focus, effort, right? Like the train lines get built by the private sector, the houses get built by the private sector. They don't get built on hopes, dreams and wishes, they get built on a profit motive. Yeah. So it is important, although we're often talking about things in a civic or an equity lens, it's important to remember that profit is an important part of a successful city. The other thing I would note is, you mentioned the metro. We work with a lot of really great industry organisations that represent particular sectors, and they've got a really important role to play, whether you're the Property Council or Infrastructure Partnerships Australia or TTF. Metro is relevant to you for different parts. Where we often come in is saying, hang on, there is a focus that you have on a particular sector that is missing a holistic or the bits of the Venn diagram that overlap between your sectors. That's where we play. So overstation development is a great example where we're saying, this is a transport project, this is a housing project, it's an office project, economic development project, but it's all of these things at once, and the sum of those parts is greater than the whole. So how can we come up with an integrated kind of pitch for why this is important?
Yeah, and interestingly, I don't think we're there yet, right? I look at the first metro line, Northwest, clearly a great success, but didn't really develop property around it. In fact, developers came in and did it afterwards. Sure. So the public policy argument is, well, actually the government missed out on value capture. And you remember 2 or 3 years ago, value capture was the thing. Papers were being produced
every 3 or 4 years. Someone's like, hang on a minute, we should do this thing.
Let's capture this value. And of course, it didn't really work. Then in City Southwest, now the rest of it, we're seeing sort of commercial office buildings, Victoria Cross, Martin Place, which has just been an outstanding contribution to the city, but hard fought to get that. The unsolicited proposal on Martin Place was a very long dated process. And to be honest, it would not have been successful if Macquarie had not backed it. Right? Macquarie being, one of the great Australian firms and one of the great residents of Sydney, really. Yeah,
and willing to stump up a
lot of money
and take risk.
And take risk to get that project off the line. And that's why we have that asset, right? I think we are, and you and I find ourselves on panels and different venues arguing this case. Not always on the same side, I should say, for the benefit of our audience, which helps. It helps with good debate. I still think we are not learning the lessons of these procurement processes to say, well, how can we do some of this better? Right? Yeah. And why? And part of me wonders whether it is and something I want to get to later, which is, are we over bureaucratizing cities, right? And in fact, it's a question I want to get to, but to set that up though, I'm going to ask you this question first, which is, so you've been in this advocacy game for cities for a long time. You had a career in civil service as well, so you've seen both sides. Are cities actually working?
Yeah, well, it's a qualified yes. Look, the reality is...
It's not an easy question, is it?
Look, there's a simple answer, which is, they clearly are, because the global population is urbanising faster than we kind of ever predicted it would. More and more people are flocking to cities because they see them as places of opportunity, of safety, of enjoyment, of access, of a whole bunch of really great benefits that they can't get to outside of cities. We've got to remember that Australia alone, 70% of the population lives in a major city. This is actually a very urbanised country, and in that sense...
East coast of Australia is really the dominant part of Australia.
Totally, right? And if you take in sort of you get a little bit of the rest of the coastline, that's 90% of the population.
Pretty much. Yeah.
So in that sense, clearly they're working. People are voting with their feet and with their wallets to move into these cities. And in a way, you could look at housing unaffordability in Sydney as kind of a a side effect of the success of cities. More people want to be in Sydney than can be in Sydney, and that's pushed prices up, supply and demand of that. So in that sense, yes, they're working. But the qualification to that is clearly they're not working for everyone. Clearly cities are leaving people behind. It still matters far more than it should your postcode. Your experience of Sydney as a city differs dramatically depending on which part of the city you live in.
So just explain that a bit more. What do you mean by that?
So, this is an oversimplification, but not much of an oversimplification. The further west you go in Sydney, the further south you go in Sydney, the worse your access and opportunity is on almost every single measure. Your access to jobs, your access to public transport, your access to great communities, to walkable spaces, good schools, good healthcare services, cool, calm climates, everything.
But isn't that
worse.
the case in every city, though? That's if you went to New York, and you would say, well, if I went east or west of Manhattan, you'd have the same story. If you went to London and you went beyond the outskirts of central London, you'd probably have the same argument.
Yeah, I think, yes, it's true of every city. It's more true of Sydney than other cities, though. So taking London as an example, 20% of the housing stock in London is social and affordable housing. That means that the bottom cohort, the bottom quintile of the entire population has support to live a good life. And if you think of those people as actually often quite critically important to the success of your city, because that's where the cleaners are, that's where the first year nurses often are, and they really matter to the success of your city. You have a buffer, a safety net to support the city thriving in that sense. The equivalent percentage, so 20% in London, is 4% in Sydney. So in terms of housing affordability, it's worse in Sydney. The equivalent in Hong Kong is 30% of housing is social and affordable. Obviously we know Singapore, it's 80% and it's slightly different. But there is undoubtedly something that the urban safety net of Sydney is worse than it is in other cities.
But it's interesting, obviously Hong Kong's my hometown, right?
Sure.
And so I know there, it is the most expensive city still in the world.
Correct.
Think that, again, I think the Premier Min said the other day that we might be ranking just behind it, which is quite frightening.
Terrible,
right?
yeah.
I will say on the Hong Kong housing scheme works because they introduced a first home ownership scheme, and it's not a help to buy or sort of model or a first home buy deposit, or it is actual concessional, it's actual concessional, you pay as you go model, all the way to the top, right? The Singaporean model works because the Lee Kuan Yew made a decision. He made two core decisions, didn't he? He made one core decision that there are a country of multiple cultures that will all speak one language. Everybody must speak the same language. You can speak whatever other language you want.
Sure, but
English.
you will speak English.
You will speak English.
Yep.
Which surprisingly in Hong Kong, being a British colony, was not the case.
Yeah, interesting.
And we can go into lots of Eamon Fitzpatrick, another Eamon was on my show recently, and both of us were from Hong Kong, and we went to the same junior school actually in Hong Kong, which is interesting. So we had a little bit of this debate. But the second big decision Lee Kuan Yew made was that housing was a right that he would give and the government would give to all Singaporeans. And so every Singaporean has the right to own a house or own an apartment, right, in Singapore, which has basically enabled that city to develop in the way it did. So I look at those examples and look at our public policy and kind of wonder, well, why was it different here in the way we were thinking, and why is it different to the UK? And how have we ended up in this position where we have the most unaffordable housing in the world? And why is it that our policy framework hasn't adopted more akin to a Singapore or a Hong Kong? How come that hasn't come into play? And the answer I have is twofold. And I'm going to put this out there, and you can tell me if I'm wrong.
Yeah.
The first is we still don't like the idea of people actually living in the core CBD. And we don't like apartments. We think apartments are bad. If you listen to some federal politicians, they still talk about the Australian dream of the backyard and
white
cricket.
picket fence, etc.
I love that concept too, but if we're going to have affordable housing, it's tough to get if you're closer into the city than further away from it. So I think that's one thing. So there's that concept of not in my backyard. I want this. You're not going to have apartments. And the second one I look at is that, and Rob Stokes talks about this a lot, is that in Australia, and to a lesser extent in Canada and the UK, housing is an investment class. And as a consequence of that, messing with the housing market then means you're messing with a lot of the wealth of Australians.
Yeah.
And that is the conundrum we sort of face in the housing sector. Would you agree or disagree with that?
I agree with 1.5 of
your two ideas. It's not a bad result.
I completely agree with the tension between housing as investment versus housing as safety, security. And I've got a lot of sympathy for those that have done the right thing with the tax incentives and the tax regimes we have to invest in housing as a way to support their retirement and to live a good life.
Yeah.
But undoubtedly that has created added demand pressure on our housing market, that actually it's not just people looking for a place to live in, it's people looking for a place to fund their retirement and to live a good life in addition to the place they already own. I would agree on that. Second one, you mentioned the CBD. I think there's a really key point you've said there around this tension between a kind of a dream of the freestanding home and the idea of affordability that is kind of vested in apartments and smaller private spaces. What we do find when we survey Australians, and when we survey Sydneysiders, is that actually the dream of the freestanding home is probably only the dream of about 50% of Sydneysiders, but it's about 70% of the housing stock.
Oh, interesting.
So there's about 20% of people for whom they live in a freestanding home but would prefer all of the benefits that they get in an apartment and would be willing to trade off the space to get it.
So why don't they?
Because they don't exist, because there's not enough of the apartments for them to access.
Of the quality that they want?
Or just purely the stock. 30% of the housing stock is apartments and 50% of the population want to live in them.
Really? I didn't realise the apartment stock was that small.
Yeah.
Okay.
So partly because around here, obviously, in certain, there are plenty of postcodes where it's 100% of the stock, but across the breadth of Sydney, it's actually not much. And so, I do think we hear sometimes stories of saying, oh, freestanding homes is what people want. It's what some people want. There is a huge cohort of people for whom they're not actually getting access to the types of housing they want, which is apartment living in proximity to amenity and infrastructure and employment and education and all that sort of stuff, which you kind of can only get with the density of people that apartments unlocks, right? You cannot do a walkable community where you can walk to all of your daily needs, your kids can walk to school, and you can get access to a deep labour market to earn a lot of money, whilst also having a really low density city.
Yeah.
So that tension, I think, is one that we've had we do need to dispel the myth that the Australian dream is the freestanding home. It is for plenty. And certainly that number is coming down, right? Like probably if we went back 40 years and surveyed Australians, 90% of people would want.
Yeah, I think we should also say, I think the dream of the freestanding home is not just an Australian dream. It is a British dream, a Canadian dream, an American dream. It's for a component of the population. But I think if you speak to a New Yorker, many of them are quite happy living in apartments in New York because they love living in New York. The density of New York is what makes it, an exciting place, a thrilling place to live.
Parisians or people
Parisians
in Barcelona and these sorts of places.
I mean, this is Australia. We don't talk about France too much.
Or Spain.
Or Spain, for that matter. No, I'm kidding. We like Spain. We like France too. I'm just joking.
We like their transport assets,
and their food and wine.
Well,
cheese. Anyway. But the thing that I find interesting about this issue is the density question is the one that we always get tripped up on, right? So if you look at this particular city, Sydney, we love restricting the heights of buildings. Like it's a thing, right? Massive amounts of discussion about overshadowing and massive amounts of discussion about, how will we handle traffic and, planning systems that are just impossible to get through. Huge debates about GFA, and it's just, I look at it and go, why in this particular city have we done that relative to a Melbourne where they haven't? They've had more density. There's more people living in the city in Melbourne. Now, COVID has changed the way that city operates, and it has never really recovered, I've got to say. And it's I think the government there needs to look at itself and look at its policy framework and say, why has what was once a great, wonderful, vibrant city still not recovered from a pandemic that was several years ago?
Yeah.
And what do they need to do to fix it? I think here in this city, in Sydney and others, Adelaide, Perth, or Brisbane, Brisbane's on fire. Like you go to Brisbane, everyone's out, right?
It's exciting.
But surely we should be looking at ourselves a bit harder in Sydney, in the city, at least in the core CBD, which still generates 7% of the country's GDP, and say, maybe we need to be thinking a bit differently about development here. What are you hearing? What is what I'm saying completely outrageous?
So no, it's not. And we, where it's appropriate, we should be having heaps more housing in the CBD. I'll say two things though. The first is, even if we absolutely jam-packed the city with houses, it's because of the disbursement of the city. Like, it's a very large city geographically, right? Like it's 80 k's east to west.
The core CBD isn't though.
No, the core CBD is 2 square kilometres.
Yeah.
You probably can get maybe 3,000 or 4,000 homes into the CBD if you really, maximise that.
Which would then enliven the CBD more.
It would be, I like it as a model to do interesting things and better things and make your CBD more fun.
Yeah.
We can't be thinking of this as the panacea to housing affordability, because at the scale this city's got to build 200,000 homes.
They're two different issues is what you're saying.
It's just not at the scale that it's going to have that kind of impact. To the other point around our planning system, you look at development in Melbourne that takes a third of the time to get approved, and it's not a third of the quality. It's the same quality, right? Like, there is clearly something broken if that's what's happening across the system, that it takes so long to get the same outcome that other people seem to manage at a quicker pace. My premise on this is that I think we have a really bad culture in government and in community and in media and in public debates around risk. I think we don't have a risk tolerant or risk managing culture. We have a risk averse or risk removal culture. And so a lot of that planning really is about saying, I don't want to be holding the bag if something goes wrong, so let's just double, triple, quadruple check that this is totally okay before I sign off on it.
Interesting.
And that is, we see that in a lot of different spaces. We definitely see it in...
As in, I don't want to get into trouble, therefore I'm going to double check
the motivations that we ascribe to public servants, I saw this as a public servant for a couple of years, is if you make a bold and risky decision, you don't get rewarded for it. But if that bold and risky decision goes badly, you get fired.
You get slammed,
So what's the incentive to ever take a risk, when actually saying, hey, I need you to get another consultant to do another study, will never be punished, because that's actually, right and proper and, risk averse. And so, we get into, like, obviously New South Wales has an interesting, unique culture around corruption. Like, we have had big corruption problems, and that's, a lot of it gets articulated as I would say, in my time in government, 50% of the reasons why people would say no to a thing is, I don't want to end up in ICAC.
Because the corruption body here is so strong.
Yeah.
Right.
And that would be things where you're like, well, where's the corruption risk in here? And they're like, I don't know, man, but I don't want to touch it. I don't want to end up in ICAC.
And look, we can get into a very interesting conversation about the ICAC, right? Because I would say, and I've got to be honest, I think the strength of that body and the fear of that body is hindering the development of the city, because people are concerned that they're going to be paraded in front of a group of lawyers who don't know anything about the development process or property or anything, and be just accused of some wrongdoing. And even if they're cleared afterwards or no proceeding has happened, or all you've got to do is be interviewed by these people, and in the court of public opinion, you're now guilty.
You're guilty.
How do you make decisions in that environment?
Yeah.
I just,
So ICAC is a symptom of a larger issue, because that ICAC, that public sort of destruction of your character doesn't happen in isolation. It's not ICAC doing that to you. It's the way that our media and public debates happen. It's the way that politicians operate, and the assessments that they've taken around that. A good example would be politicians who referred the Rose Hill unsolicited proposal to ICAC.
I didn't realise they did that.
This is corrupt, and ICAC were like, there's nothing here. Like, why? No, we're not going to investigate this. But the fact that you would jump to that, where you're like, can you articulate a corruption risk that has happened here, and they're just like, just feels weird. You're like, yeah, risks feel weird. That's kind of the point in risk management, is that you mitigate against, those risks, but you accept that you can't mitigate against everything, because that is also getting rid of innovation and, new ideas. So I don't want to lay the blame squarely at the feet of ICAC, because I think ICAC is a symptom of a wider cultural challenge that we have in Sydney, in Australia, in society in general, that sees public decision making as something to remove risk rather than manage risk.
But why is it a New South Wales symptom then? I mean, there's an IBAC in Victoria, Queensland has something similar. Why are they faster then?
Part is a very high profile ICAC. ICAC has always been more high profile and more kind of looming large in public debate in Sydney, because we've lost a couple of premiers to ICAC, right?
That's right.
That hasn't happened at the same sort of scale or speed at the national level or in other states. But also part of it is this has always been a city that builds stuff. We're a property developer city. We articulate wealth and success through physical things that get built.
Stuff,
And that has a tendency to lend itself to, visible corruption. Like, let's be honest, there's been plenty of, corruption around property development at times in our, recent history.
Yeah.
And that, that...
Not involving anyone we should know.
No. Of course not.
Just in case the ICAC is watching this show.
Yeah. But I guess it's, and because of that physical space and the way that our, we've structured government, that also then necessarily brings government into it, because there's planning decisions and government decisions.
Yeah.
Whereas decisions that might have been made in a financial services space, might be risky but not corrupt, don't get articulated in the same way in a public discussion.
Yeah.
Whereas anything that's visible, it's easy to capture the public's imagination about this building is different, or it breaches XYZ guidelines, therefore maybe there's a corruption here.
And so there's and I don't want this to become a discussion about ICAC, but it does have a role here, because the one thing I keep emphasizing to people we work with is I just find the concept of planning risk in property development bizarre. Because essentially, you're involved in a transaction oftentimes with government, a government agency, and the government will say, well, you, private sector, are responsible for the planning risk.
Right, yeah.
I'm like, well, your planning colleagues are over there, right?
Yeah.
Go and have a chat to them. Why don't you guys align the planning decision with, with what you're proposing?
Right.
And, we had this case here with Barangaroo, Barangaroo Central, where one agency bid the deal, a proponent came in and, won a tender process, and was then told, okay, now you're going to go and deal with planning risk.
Yeah.
And, off they went, and obviously that planning risk was real. It was a real risk.
Totally.
And so I just look at that and go, if we want to be a community that does things, you can't suggest that a government process is actually a commercial risk.
Right.
Like, that is ridiculous to me.
Or if there is a risk there, that risk shouldn't be held by a fellow government agency.
Well, that's right.
That's the other part.
Then you ask, well, why do things cost so much money? Well, this is when
because you've got to tack on 30% to the cost of everything,
price
because you're
risk,
holding
right?
government risk that the government agency doesn't want to hold itself.
So then we go into this question of who is best to hold the risk.
Yeah.
And in the case of planning risk, surely it's got to be government.
But because the motivations and the incentives that we've designed for the government are to minimise risk, what's a really easy way to get planning risk off your books? Put it on the private sector's books.
So now that we furiously agree that is the case, what do we do? Because if you go back to where we were talking about the housing challenge, you put out some numbers.
Yeah.
The Treasurer and the Premier in the state were out there recently saying we're at the point now where we're losing young people from the city to other places. You can't just replace your society through migration. You actually have to have children.
Yep.
You can't afford to have children if you can't afford to live somewhere.
Yep.
It's warmer in Brisbane. It's nice there. I can get an equal salary job there on 60% of the housing cost. Why wouldn't I live in Queensland? I don't have to support the Reds. I can still support New South Wales, whatever, right?
Yeah.
You can do all those things. If it's the case then that our glittering, glorious harbour city is at risk because of this sort of thing, and I should say the broader state, what do we do?
So Oh, so many things, Jason. I mean, let's start really philosophical, and I'll talk about two different books that I've read that really inspired me around.
Should I be breaking out the scotch or?
Yeah, the cigars.
Maybe we should do that. You know, Bill Maher has a podcast where he actually drinks scotch. And
all right, and as the podcast goes on, people
and
get
they just get here we are, in
we're just
suits,
drinking water and long blacks. So. If I take a left-wing perspective and a right-wing perspective on this challenge of risk, Nicholas Nassim Taleb, he's a right-wing philosopher.
Oh my God, we're going straight into that, are we?
Yeah,
okay.
Wrote a book called Skin in the Game.
Yeah,
Premise being, it's a good book, really compelling. Premise being basically those that don't have any downside risk for bad decisions or upside benefit of good decisions make worse decisions. I think that's a really interesting premise to apply to government. What is the upside benefit that someone gets by making a bold choice? What is the downside risk? And this is mostly public servants, right? Because politicians, the benefit hopefully is you get re-elected, but a public servant gets.
But they're not involved in the procurement decisions. The politicians are not involved in the procurement process.
So for the public service, there is the risk. The risk is lose your job, but that is you never lose your job for going too slow and being too cautious, right? Yeah. So that's a sort of a right-wing take on what this. The alternative.
I never considered Nicholas Nassim Taleb to be a right-wing writer.
I think I mostly think that because he hates governments and he thinks they're fundamentally ineffectual.
Okay.
So maybe not right-wing is the right word, but a anti-statist perspective.
Or libertarian sort of view. Yeah. Interesting.
So at the other end of the spectrum is Mazzucato. Mariana Mazzucato, who is very statist. She believes in the entrepreneurial state.
Yeah.
And she would argue quite similarly, really, that governments should be entrepreneurial in their approach to all things that they do. And an entrepreneur takes risks. Risk is part of the job, right?
Yeah.
You're never going to be a successful company if you don't take risks. And so I think that there is a language that can appeal to politicians of any, political persuasion around the role that government can play in doing better with the resources that they have. And government's 30% of the economy in Australia, right?
And growing.
It has to be part of the solution. We cannot just say, let's remove government from this because they own heaps of land, they have heaps of money, they are spending things, and they should be doing that more entrepreneurially with skin in the game.
So I totally agree. In fact, I am a firm advocate of government being an equity holder in projects, right? And I argue this endlessly. And when I first started, I argued this in government when we started the WestConnex motorway project. Was a privately financed structure that started 100% government owned and was sold down over time.
Yep.
But that importantly, it was done in such a way that it was private sector led, but with government shareholders. I have been firmly of the view that government should have equity stakes in things because the taxpayer deserves a return on its investment.
Totally.
And its investment shouldn't just be through asset sales. It should be through capturing the upside of developments. The problem, however, with this has been that the government, because of this risk aversion, has said, I like the upside, but I don't like the downside.
Yeah.
So I want a floor. So underneath the floor, it's all you. Above the floor, I want 80%. It's like, it doesn't quite work like that.
That's not quite how profit motives work, mate.
It's not how, and also the other thing is that I want the cash now, I don't want it later.
Yeah.
And so as development companies, we make money on cash coming in over time at the end of a development project. Yeah. But it means that there's a lot of money going out up front and it all comes in at the back end and then you get your payment, right? So when we talk about 20 plus returns and all blah, blah, people say, geez, those development profits are high, right?
Smear that over 5 years and see what it looks like, right?
Smear that over 10 years, right? Like, we're sitting at Barangaroo right now, which took, almost 20 years to build. Yeah. It's still only just finished now, right? So it gives you sort of an idea.
Yeah,
right?
totally.
And it's the same with, we're looking at some of the Sydney metro stations now. The line doesn't open until 2032.
Yeah.
The development happens after that. So the capital you put out now needs to be recovered over time.
And part of also what you're articulating, it's a bit of an indictment. It's interesting, you mentioned kind of the need for government to get money up front. my view is that government is supposed to be there for the long term. They're custodians of public value and public good. They're there to look out for not just the next year or the next 3 years, but the next 20, 50, 100
Correct.
years, right? And to smooth out business cycles and shocks and stresses and these.
It's hard when you've got a 4-year electoral cycle.
So isn't that an indictment that you're experiencing times when the private sector has more of a long-term vision than government does? That is totally incorrect, and in part it's because cost of living has become kind of the topic du jour. Governments need to address cost of living, and I feel like that often means that they make decisions to spend now rather than to invest for the future.
Oh, I think that's evident. You just need to look at the fiscal position of every state
Right.
and the country to know that we're spending far beyond on consumption,
Right.
rather than investment. Now, I mean, New South Wales is a bit of a different case because I looked at its debt position the other day, and COVID intensified its debt position, but a lot of it is capital expenditure on infrastructure, right?
Yeah.
And to Min's government credit, they're continuing that infrastructure spend, right? They did look for a while at whether they should build the West Metro or not, and then they were told in no uncertain terms that would not be a good idea to kill it. And to their credit, they continued with it, right?
Yeah.
I would argue they probably don't want to spend so much on it, but they have to.
Yeah.
And I think it will change.
Wouldn't we all?
Well,
it's still worth it, right? Like this is the point. Is like, yes, it would be nice if it was the original, quoted number of whatever it was, $18 billion. It isn't, but it's still going to be transformative.
It isn't, and it isn't because of. It's not because of some mistake or incompetence or any of that stuff. It's because the price of stuff has gone up,
and people.
And people and capital, all of it's gone up, and the world suffered a major shock with the pandemic, a global shock. We haven't finished going through that, and that has come through into prices. It has across the board, and that is just the nature of infrastructure spend. And you just have to go, well, is this something we need to do or not? And I think the existing metro tells us that it is. Right? And let's bear in mind as well, this is the only state that is actually doing an actual metro.
Yeah.
Like Brisbane Metro is not a metro. Cross River Rail is an extension of the railway line. Melbourne Metro is an extension of the existing railway line. This Sydney's Metro is a high-capacity, single-deck automated train service that rivals any city anywhere in the world. That's the difference. And it's the sort of infrastructure this state needed and this city needed because of its contribution to the Australian economy. And I look at it now, and I looked at GST flows the other day, and I cannot for the life of me understand how we're in a situation where Victoria is a recipient state rather than a contributor state. The second most populated state in this country, that just shouldn't be the case. And that tells you we're spending far more than we should be on consumption and not enough on production.
And an investment, I mean, I'm very careful, I'm not going to criticise Victoria because I'm very cautious of saying, the Sydney-Melbourne
No, I'm not buying into that debate. I'm just simply looking at the facts.
Yeah.
The simple facts, right?
What I will say is that people also don't probably fully realise just how transformative the investment in public transport has been in Sydney. In the period between 2016 and 2024, we were opening more public transport than any other city in the world other than Milan and Singapore.
Really?
Yeah, top 3. Because actually we're like, oh yeah, cool, it's another metro line, we're getting one of those every 6 years or so. We have short memories. Yeah. Actually, the vast majority of big cities around the world are opening nothing at all. You look at the investments that New York is trying to make into their subway right now. Yeah. They're easily a decade behind us in terms of their sophistication and investment in new kind of extensions and new stops. Yeah. Their extension, I think, is an additional 4 stops, and we've opened 16 stops in that same time.
I remember them debating connecting New Jersey.
Right.
It's ridiculous. Of course you'd have a train line to New Jersey.
Yeah.
people are travelling an hour and a half from New Jersey to Manhattan.
Yeah. So I think it is important to remember that Sydney is, if there is and I would say that one of the challenges Sydney's had is a low density development pattern focused overly on private vehicle transport. So like basically people have to drive long distances in cars to get to the things they need in the city because we made it a really low density city. The way you get yourself out of that is you provide people with alternatives. And public transport, big, heavy trunk transport like metro and light rail and, improved B lines and rapid bus transit, that's the way you get people out of their cars. And then you then are also catalysing density that allows people to live closer to things.
So I was listening to something in the UK the other day that said the number of young people getting driver's license is falling every year.
Yeah.
So young people are choosing not to have a driver's license because they don't need to drive the car. Is that the case in Australia?
You know what's funny? We have, one of the planning controls that we have in Sydney is parking minimums. If you build a one-bedroom apartment in certain LGAs, it's got to be at least one parking spot for that.
Yeah.
Two-bedroom, it's two parking spots, etc. The parking minimums that our city has set are higher than the driver's license ownership rates today. And those rates are dropping.
Is that right?
So
is that a cost of thing? Is it a cost to have a car? I mean, when we were kids, the idea was you getting your driver's license was a rite of passage.
Yeah.
Right?
Part of it's a change pattern of, if you're living in an apartment near a train station, you don't need a car. Part of it's about novel, shared transport options. Well, I needed a car 1 trip or 2 trips a week. I'll just get an Uber instead.
Yeah, Uber's changed things.
I'll get a go-get, whatever, these sorts of things. I'll get a Lime bike. There are lots of alternatives available to them that you can actually combine together to have a cheaper, more reliable and more flexible transport kind of suite than owning a private vehicle that gets used maybe 2% of the time. So that's part of it. And part of it is, change behaviours. Young people aren't, COVID has, accelerated a bunch of stuff, but they're not travelling as far distances.
I'm really interested in the whole perspective of young Australians, young people now, because us middle-aged people like to opine, they can't afford a house, we're going to run out of kids. And I think to myself, I met a young girl just graduating from university yesterday, and it was interesting what she said to me. She said, I really want to go into consulting and advisory. I want to advise people how to make the world a better place. And I'm like, well, I get that, right? I get that. But in order to advise people how to make the world a better place, you have to learn how it works first. Yeah. You actually work in the factory, work in the engineering firm, learn, then you can advise them. Can't make it better unless you be inside a place. I do wonder whether we are telling our young people that they shouldn't be aspiring to housing. They shouldn't be aspiring to things. You will never get there. You will never do this. You will never do that. And I wonder whether our own narrative, we argue that the boomers have, done all this stuff to us and we're suffering and blah, blah, and you guys have no chance if our sandwich generation has no chance, that you have no chance. I just wonder whether that narrative is wrong.
I mean, on current trajectories, it's not wrong.
The numbers are saying
we need to change the trajectory, right? The narrative comes with a trajectory. I don't know which one comes first, but our data shows that kids born today, let me take a step back. Baby boomers, more than 80% of them owned their own home outright by the time they retired. Yeah. Every generation it drops by about 5% by point of retirement. Kids born today, less than half of them will ever own a home in this city. So more than half of them will be lifetime renters for their lives, just based on the existing trajectory and trends of home ownership rates. So on the data, telling kids today, you probably will never own a home in Sydney is true. But odds on they won't.
Okay, but does that mean failure?
Yeah.
Is the question, right? So,
totally.
You will never own a home in Sydney, you'll rent a home in Sydney.
Yeah.
But you might own a home somewhere else. Yeah. You might have invested in other assets. You might have created a business. You might have, what I'm trying to say is, owning a home does not equate wealth.
Totally.
Right? It's like, okay, you might not own a home in Sydney because you don't feel that that's a good investment for you.
Yep.
And you've decided to go and invest in some tech stock and basically do a lot better in the market, or you might have started a business, or you might have had whatever.
Yep.
And where you live is just, a function of that.
Totally.
That it's just part of your cost structure.
Yeah. So I hope that we're seeing a generation who rejects some of what we class as, a good life, in part because they're like, look, if that's what you think a good life is like, and you're saying I'm never going to get it, I'm going to reinvent what a good life looks like.
Exactly. Maybe it is. That's exactly right.
What I want is I want flexibility. I don't want to be tied down to one city my whole life. I want to rent in Sydney because every year I might spend 3 months in the south of France because I can work remotely and that's going to be my life. And actually owning a home would just be a hassle,
burden, and
a drag.
Do I need this corporate life that you guys all aspired to when you were at university in a big bad company? Maybe I want a portfolio career where I get to sort of start my own business and work for multiple clients. And
I want
do a
7
bunch
side
of stuff.
hustles. Actually, that's what I want for a life.
The person that built our first website when we started, this girl was one of my business partners dealt with her, but she did websites, but she also worked in a dental clinic.
Right.
And teeth whitening or something, and she was running that sort of business, like completely different businesses. Like I'm not saying that that's the future, but
no, sure. And I guess
I am getting the sense that young people are looking at life a bit differently.
And I think that is exciting. We just need to make sure that people don't get left behind, I suppose. So because the flip side of flexibility is insecurity. The flip side of a portfolio life is living hand to mouth, or struggling. There are good fundamental reasons why we, of our generation, decided that certain things were important for life, because we kind of knew in our heads, look, I'm really bad at assessing long-term benefit versus short-term costs, but I'm convinced that buying a house and paying it off over 30 years is a good long-term investment, and it just is set and forget. I don't have to continually be making a test for myself of, can I afford to spend this money on going out for dinner or not? Because I know that my mortgage is being taken out of my pay.
But isn't that then a question of how we teach personal responsibility and personal accountability and personal accounting? I mean, are we really saying that? Are we really saying, I like these set and forget things like a mortgage because it will stop me from being irresponsible with my money?
Yeah.
Do like that's sort of...
Well, I mean, I do. Like, I'm pretty irresponsible with my money, Jason. I love the fact that I'm just like, look, if push comes to shove, if I'm really wondering whether I should buy that last glass of wine, I know at least that, like, the money to, for a roof over my head and my kid's head has been paid for already.
Has been taken care of.
I mean, there is something, like, I take your point, and, like, that stuff is valid, but there is also something like humans, in our Neolithic hunter-gatherer brains are really bad at assessing short and long-term benefits and costs.
And again, the data bears that out. Like, there was a stat the other day, don't quote me, but a huge percentage of the population couldn't survive an emergency over $10,000 or something. Like, there's not enough there. The rise of this concept of the buy now, pay later pool, which I find an extraordinary concept. You buy your house, you get all your furniture and your television and whatever else, zero interest for 3 years, and then it all hits at once in 3 years. So it bears it out, right?
I mean, I think that is. Oh, look, like a big part of my job on almost any policy issue we're grappling with is a fundamental truth, which is to fix a problem, it's cheaper to spend the money now, to invest in it now, than to wait till the problem gets worse. But you've got to have the money now to do that, right? So if we're saying, let's say climate change, we know that investing in renewables today will cost less than grappling with the consequences of a climate that warmed by 3 degrees, let's say, or drinking water. We know that if a drought hits and we haven't identified new sources of drinking water, the dams run out before the new sources come online. So we should be investing in these things today. Housing affordability. We know that if we let it get worse and worse and worse, it starts a death spiral of the prosperity of our city, the ability for us to get cleaners into, clean offices.
A city without
nurses.
Grandchildren, as Peter Achterstradt says, right?
I mean, he's Peter. Yes, that is a big problem. There is a generational problem. I do also think there's a sectoral problem, right? Like, I would say I really. Peter's point resonates with me, and I would counter with a city without carers is a city that doesn't work. Like, actually, if you look at who are the people really squeezed by this, it is people who work in care sectors, basically, because they'll never earn very much money, and their work tends to be in places that they can't afford to live. So if you're a nurse, if you're an aged care worker, a disability worker, a childcare worker, the demand is typically further east, further north, and where you can afford to live is further west.
And I will be controversial in saying, all of those things you aimed at government-supported industries. Right? And so an argument that I've been mounting unsuccessfully, I might say, is that when we build a hospital, we should build worker accommodation with that hospital.
Completely agree.
Because it's not a new concept. I mean, in the 1950s, that's exactly what happened. If
Yeah.
you go to Canberra or any of these places, the sort of worker accommodation was there.
We do it with defence, right? We have defence
with
housing
defence
because we
housing,
recognise that not every person who is in the army needs to buy a house in Townsville, but we need to get them living there.
And
right?
also, they won't necessarily be living in Townsville forever, right? They'll be there for a few years.
As a concept, it has existed in Australia for a long time. but
Mining
ironically-
companies own houses. I was out in far western New South Wales a couple of weeks ago. The mining companies own multiple houses there for their staff,
Many,
right?
yeah, entire towns, I suspect.
Yeah.
You know, we historically used that. So we had, for example, Teachers Housing New South Wales, and that was really actually to incentivise teachers to go to regional and remote areas, because that's where they were struggling to find teachers. The next generation is going to be the reverse. They'll be happy to go to Dubbo because they can get affordable housing there on the market. It'll be the public school in Bondi that will be the one that's desperately struggling to find teachers who can afford to.
So I've been arguing to governments in Australia now that you're buying this new stuff, you're buying hospitals, you're buying new schools. Let's think about how we combine that with accommodation for staff, and it particularly works with the hospital.
Yes,
because the hospital has thousands of workers, right? That you co-locate there, and then you can work that into your enterprise agreement and whatever else, right? Because they say we can't afford to pay our people enough, we can't afford to pay nurses enough, blah blah. Well, you can support that by giving them accommodation. If they have accommodation, they're more likely to stick as well.
Totally,
right?
And not move to Queensland
and
or
not
Victoria.
move to Queensland or wherever
all
else.
of the wage bargaining that's been happening in New South Wales is essentially all of the gains that those industries gained have been gobbled up completely and more by rising house prices.
Which means that they come back for more again, right?
Totally, but it speaks to actually these people weren't underpaid, they were overpaying for housing.
Yeah.
And solving, we can't solve housing overnight, so we're solving for the wages because we're like, please don't leave. We really need nurses for the next 20
years. But we made the mistake in a policy front of saying, actually, we're going to put all the load on wages, and we're not going to have any non-wage benefits.
Totally.
And then we'll...
And I mean, we completely agree. All of the criticisms, you'll often hear criticisms saying, well, but you can only build 100 homes next to that hospital and there are 1,000 people. Who gets to decide who lives there? I honestly couldn't care, but those 100 people, pick it by lottery, pick it by random, whatever, but that's 100 people that are not tired when they show up to shift.
Just apply for it in your wage negotiation, right? You can say you can take it as cash or take it as housing.
Interesting thought.
I mean, these are not new concepts, right? There's nothing new in the world. I've sort of learned this over time. There are iterations of things, and there are twists on things, and there are pivots on things, but there is always a basis for something, right? And we make decisions, we think things are better, and all of a sudden we go back and look at, actually that wasn't so bad, right? So I think, when we talk about risk, and government risk in particular, some of that has to be about, well, actually, maybe it isn't such a risk to say we were wrong. Maybe how we did it before actually was all right.
Couldn't agree more.
And we need to go back and look at that.
I find that to be one of the strangest things, that politicians and public servants in public are required to be 100% confident that they're doing a great job. I would love to see a leader stand up and say, hey, we're going to try this thing. It's like 49, 51% whether it's going to work. Genuinely might not work, but I think it's the best option and I hope you'll go along with it with me. Or, hey, we don't know how to fix this problem. Have you got any ideas? Because that's the truth. Behind closed doors, that's how they're talking, right? Yeah. But in public, there is an expectation that any politician that expresses any degree of uncertainty is terrible at their job.
I am seeing a change in that, though. I will say Mike Baird was pretty good at that. He would come out and say it. I think Chris Minns is increasingly a sort of leader who says, look, Peter Malinauskas is another one, who comes up there, and this is the next generation of politicians who are coming up there and saying, you know what, we don't know everything. We recognise lots of great things have happened before. We need ideas. We want ideas. I want the civil service to also adopt that attitude.
Well, they need, one of the pieces of advice we gave to a lot of incoming ministers in this most recent state government was the first thing you can do that will be incredibly impactful is go to your secretaries and your departments and tell them that you will back them to invent new ideas. That they're allowed to work on things that are not current government policy and bringing ideas to you for new things. You don't have to always do them, but you'll always back them to do that sort of stuff. Because we got a real culture over the last certainly, my period in public service, of you'd say, hey, we should do some work on this cool idea, and they say, it's not government policy, we can't possibly touch it, because if it leaks to a newspaper, the newspaper will write a story about a government secret plan, and we'll all
So make it not secret.
Right. Say, hey, we're just looking at weird ideas, and
just make it not secret.
And critically also, don't do it in secret. Be really public about it and call for those ideas, right?
Yeah.
Like one of the grand things of
Although we did have the call for big ideas, let's not forget about that.
But a great example of that, right? Like I know one organisation that put a good idea in, a big bold idea that was bold. It was, risky. And as a result of putting that big bold idea in, a government agency called them and said, hey, we're never going to give you a contract again because we disagree with this proposal.
Yeah, right. So then,
and you're like,
how is that a call for big ideas?
I thought we were being asked to come up with big, bold ideas, not implementing them necessarily, but that's a kind of a culture of not only do we not come up with ideas, but we're going to get you in trouble for coming up with one yourself.
Yeah, Tim Williams and I famously had a discussion about this when I was in government, but that's another story.
Well, famously, you mentioned Rob Stokes before.
Who's also been a guest on this podcast, by the way, both of them.
Tim and, even like big, bold ideas for transformation of cities, we've often had governments say, hey, look, that's not your remit to come up with big, bold ideas. I want 1,000 ideas out there for big, bold ideas.
Yeah, no one should ever say that's not your remit. I mean, that's ridiculous. You don't come up with new ideas by saying, oh, well, I'll just have ideas within my remit.
Particularly because, often for government, they're like, look, mate, we've only got so much money. We can't do every big, bold idea. But that shouldn't limit the ability for people to debate and discuss and hone and winnow these ideas to come up with better ones in the public debate.
Well, we'll have to end soon, which is a real shame because I think there's a lot more we can discuss. So I hope you'll come back on.
I'd love to.
But I'm going to ask you this. I'm going to ask you this before we go because Lily's waving at me, saying, come on, you always do this to me. So we talked a lot. There's a lot of things. A lot of challenges. 3 things that you're putting to government right now that you want implemented this term.
Ooh, great question. Okay, more investment into density done well. So we've got a really clear agenda from the government around housing. We need to see funding for the infrastructure and amenity that goes along with that. In part because we know that the social license for density is fragile and it needs people to constantly be seeing great places be invented and created to fill their cup up with support for more density and more density and more density. But also partly because we know that infrastructure funding is one of the reasons why a bunch of that density is not feasible currently. We need the roads, the cycleways, the trees, the sewer lines, the electricity, all that sort of stuff, right? So that's one. Number 2, we think there's huge potential for investing in workspace for creatives. There's this model called a Creative Lands Trust. We're working a little bit with the government on this one at the moment.
Cool idea.
It's a really cool idea. It's basically a not-for-profit property trust that manages workspace. Well, it's not commercial in the traditional sense. It's often really grotty, spaces that painters can do painting or, musicians can put up baffling on the walls and turn into a rehearsal studio. But creatives are being priced out of this city, and so we need to do some work.
Entirely. That's such a challenge. Right?
Third one, just this week, although probably a couple of weeks ago by the time this comes out, we launched a report called Sydney as a Renewable Energy Zone. So we've got these regional renewable energy zones, big investment in huge solar farms, wind farms and the like. The secret power that Sydney actually has in this space is 30% of the buildings in Sydney already have solar panels on their roof, and it's one of the highest in the entire world.
Yeah.
If we were to cover all of the commercial and industrial and encourage all of the houses to put solar on their rooftop, we could be generating 75% of our own power without needing to get power from anywhere outside of Sydney, just on rooftop solar alone, plus a bit of batteries. So doubling down on the potential for urban energy generation is the third one.
Cool, really good.
There's so many more, but that's
great. I mean, we'll put a link to that report in the show. But for now, Eamon Waterford, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.